Hello, and welcome to the podcast that tries to answer one simple question. What is this thing called film noir? I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. My special guest today is Dr. Vincent M. Gaine, who teaches at Lancaster University and is the author of Existentialism and Social Engagement in the Films of Michael Mann, which is just as well, as we're here to discuss Michael Mann's film Collateral, and please note that there will be spoilers throughout. The locus of Vincent's research is the intersection of globalization, liminality, and identity politics in media. He has published on contemporary film genres, cycles, and franchises, including superhero cinema, conspiracy thrillers, and James Bond, as well as contemporary auteurs including James Cameron, Catherine Bigelow, and Christopher Nolan. His current research concerns nostalgic espionage, liminal superheroes, and the social anthropological representation of Boston in media. Vincent is also a podcaster, with a monthly podcast called Invasion of the Poddy People, and he is also a regular guest on Not Just for Kids, The Uncut Network, and There Will Be Only One. He contributes film reviews to The Geek Show and The Critical Movie Critics. He will happily talk about films until the cows come home. But until that happens, listen to us chat about Michael Mann's movie from 2004. Vincent, what's the M for?
A motorway between London and Bristol.
Well, I had that coming. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Sergio. Hello, listeners. And thank you so much for inviting me on. I am thrilled to be here.
So before we get down to the nitty-gritty, icebreaker question time. First question, what is your definition of film noir?
Well, my definition of film noir, firstly, is that it doesn't exist. Because what we think of as film noir is a retrospective term. It's a critical term, as we know, devised by French critics that was applied to an unrelated group of films released in the 1940s. And they had some shared stylistic features, such as chiaroscuro lighting and sometimes voiceover. So my definition of film noir is it can pretty much be what you want it to be, because that's how it was originally defined.
Okay. In that very broad spectrum.
Sorry, I kind of dodged the question, didn't I?
So what would be the first film that you saw that kind of you thought of, people think this is film noir, even if you didn't?
Honestly, I'm not certain if I saw any as a kid or a teenager, because I was a foolish child, generally not into older black and white films. I mean, I'm pretty sure I saw Casablanca, but that's not a film noir. Therefore, the earliest I can remember seeing that I knew that's what it was came shamefully late. And this was during a module that I took as an undergraduate on film noir. And the first film on that module was The Maltese Falcon. So I think it would be hard to say that that isn't what we understand to be film noir. It is a 1941 detective film adaptation of a hard-boiled novel by
Dashiell Hammett.
Thank you, Dashiell Hammett. I thought, yes, okay, good, thank you. I'm glad you're here.
Vincent, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your current research?
I am a senior teaching associate in media at the University of Lancaster. You can find me in the School of Arts in the media and film unit. I mean, if you come and find me there, I'll consider that slightly stalkery. So maybe you just want to look me up online. I am a film researcher. I would summarize my research as being focused on GLIPOS. Yeah, I have an acronym. The intersection of globalization, liminality, and identity politics on screen. I look at film and television, and I I argue that, look at that. There's an interesting aspect of globalization. Ooh, isn't that a liminal figure or space? And what is this doing with the identity politics? My main focus is on contemporary Hollywood. I am very much a scholar of what's going on now, which, of course, inevitably means also looking at what's happened previously. I have published extensively on modern auteurs, Hollywood auteurs, if that's not too much of a contradiction. So filmmakers such as James Cameron, Catherine Bigelow, Christopher Nolan, and most significantly for our purposes today, Michael Mann. I wrote my PhD on Michael Mann, and I subsequently published a book, Existentialism and Social Engagement in the Films of Michael Mann. I've also published a book chapter on post-feminist masculinity in Heat, Philosophical Responsibility in The Last of the Mohicans, and on today's film of discussion, I published an article on Collateral as digital noir.
Well, that's a perfect tee into that. Thank you very much. So, okay, let's talk about Collateral, which is a fascinating movie, now 21 years old.
Yes, just to be sure, I've got 5 stops to make on this, and then I've got to catch a flight. So, you hang with me.
I'll stick around. Sure. Yeah. Let's make sure we get to that 5th one together. Before we even discuss what Collateral is, when did you first see the film?
I first saw Collateral at a cinema, funny enough, in Denver, Colorado. And I saw it there in September 2004, which was the year of the film's release. I was visiting a lady friend in Denver, and we went to see it together. I subsequently saw it another 3 times in the cinema because this was a couple of years into my PhD. And since I had started the PhD, Collateral was the first Mann film to be released since I started. And I made a point, therefore, of seeing it in the cinema as much as I could. And it became a great addition to my research, especially because of where it comes in Mann's career. Because prior to Collateral, Mann had done a couple of historical drama films, because he'd made The Insider in 1999 and Ali in 2001. So as a filmmaker who kind of made his name very much in the crime genre with films like Heat, Manhunter, and Thief, Collateral seemed something of a return to that genre. So it was a very interesting point in his career, I think, and of course in my own.
So before we truly dive in, for those listeners who perhaps haven't seen it yet, in which case, by the way, we're going to be spoiling the hell out of it, so you really should go watch it and to come right back. You've had your warning. How about a quick plot synopsis for those people who need to be reminded? What's it all about, Vincent?
Sure thing. Max, played by Jamie Foxx, is a Los Angeles taxi driver. He unwillingly transports Vincent, played by Tom Cruise, a hitman, around LA as Vincent dispatches his targets. Along the way, they encounter Mexican drug cartels, a jazz musician, the LAPD, and the FBI, and as well as an assistant district attorney. And they have all manner of existential discussions in the post-human wasteland of transience and disconnection that is Los Angeles.
And it's a thriller too, right?
Yes.
There's lots of shooting.
Oh, yeah. It's got shooting that is both sudden and shocking and exhilarating.
The main aspect of the film that I think from a genre standpoint that comes out from the noir side of it is this idea of the professional killer suffering with some sort of existential crisis. An assassin with ennui. And obviously a lot of them tend to come from France. Jean-Pierre Melville's Le Samurai is sort of the classic one, but there are in fact many, many others. There's Don Siegel's The Lineup, there's Murder by Contract, there's La Femme Nikita, there's all sorts of films. And then, of course, you get into, the Bourne series or the John Wick series, which have a very different kind of feel and dynamic. Do you think they're even the same genre or the same approach?
And somewhere in between the two, you have Leon.
Leon the Professional, yes, exactly, yes, as some might call it, which is, yes, both French and American.
Indeed.
I think there is a kind of specific Frenchness about some of it. All those films that start with the letter L. So, does it fall into that category? Is it an existential killer noir?
It's certainly existential. Yes, this is an existential thriller. I mean, it's very explicitly at times to do with discussions around being and nothingness, if we want to get Heideggerian here. And I think the fact that we're dealing with this, one of our protagonists or antagonist, anti-hero, is an assassin who has a particular perspective, shall we say, on the world, who seems to, I think, have very much embraced nothingness. And all he has within nothingness is being. Having said that, I don't know if I would describe Vincent in Collateral as suffering from ennui. I think he has kind of gone past that. He has moved into a state of he has embraced it. He does not see any meaning in the world, so he's simply getting out of it what he can. He is living until he dies. So if we think about some of the key tenets of existentialism, he has this anticipation of death. Jumping right to the end of the film, his own death, when it takes place, spoilers, as we've said, he accepts it. And by a similar token, he accepts the death of others, which he, of course, inflicts. I wouldn't characterize him as having ennui. I'd actually use the expression he does himself of indifference. He does what he does and other people do what they do. What he does happens to involve killing people. He is without conscience. He is described at one point as being a smooth-talking sociopath. He is a private sector assassin, but he has, it's indicated that he's previously had military experience. So whatever humanity, whatever compassion he might have had, maybe he never had it. And that's part of, I think, the genius of the film, that it suggests these things without clarifying, so we can speculate. I think it would be reductive to say he doesn't care, but he's almost gone beyond caring. He recognizes there's no point in caring. He's in nothingness, and all there is being, I think, would be the way I describe him.
So he's post-ennui, really.
Yeah.
At this point, he's at his midlife crisis. He's on the other side, almost. In a way, do you think that the character of Max is there partly to provide a contrast? Obviously, he's a more everyman figure that we can connect to. So he's an audience identification figure to some extent, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, that person's cool or whatever, or gets to do things I don't get to do, so isn't that exciting, which is obviously a standard movie thing. But it's also something that tends to suggest that there's something in Max that Vincent is at some level interested in. So, there's a little bit, or a few molecules left of him wanting to sort of connect with the species as a whole, or at least on an individual basis. What do we think about Max as someone who is this taxi driver who seems to have aspirations, but then we find out just how long he's been working on, you tell us. I mean, he's been working on this limo business, right?
Yes, it was interesting watching Collateral again now, having not seen it for quite some time, when I'm more middle-aged than when it first came out. He's a cab driver. He's been doing this for 12 years, he says, but he's putting together a limousine company. And I think that makes him, yes, absolutely, he is an everyman. He is relatable. I think, you go into a particular job and you think it's going to be part-time, or at least it's temporary. You're going to go at it until something better comes along. There's a line in Friends, of all things, when Chandler says that he's been promoted at work, so he quit because that was supposed to be a temporary job after college, but he's been in it for years, because you get comfortable.
And Big Al calls me into his office and tells me he wants to make me processing supervisor.
That is great! Congratulations!
So, I quit.
Why?
Why? This was supposed to be a temp job.
Yeah, Chandler, you've been there for 5 years.
If I took this promotion, it would be like admitting that this is what I actually do.
I worked in insurance customer service for 17 years because I was trying to get into higher education. If Vincent is post-ennui, Max is pre-ennui, because he doesn't realize it, that he is stuck. He is driving around. He is rotating, much as his cab is. There's again, talking about this being a digital noir, it's almost like he's been programmed to move into this same pattern. And the reason I think of it as digital noir, which we'll talk about in more detail, is that when we get the overhead shots of LA, the way the city blocks are laid out, because it's at night and the lights are showing, it looks like a circuit board or a motherboard of a computer. And Max is one byte in that aspect. And I think while on the one hand we can think about it in these depersonalized ways, that itself makes it so relatable. This idea of being just a number, being just a series of zeros and ones is absolutely what makes Max relatable. And then this is the noir trope, I suppose, of this everyman who takes a trip down the dark side. I'm oddly especially reminded of the original British version of Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much. I mean, it's kind of pre-noir, really, a 1930s film, which is very much about a man who gets this information that he can't really deal with, and he is constantly being contained or belittled by his circumstances. Or another good example would be Holly Rollins in The Third Man. He's getting stuck in this world which is bigger than him, and he doesn't really understand it. And what's interesting about Max is, of course, on the one hand, he's doing exactly what he always does. He is driving his taxi around LA, but he is quite literally going to the parts of LA that he doesn't normally think about, that he doesn't engage with or confront, because he is contained. His taxi cab contains him. It's great when we're introduced to Max. He's there at the depot for the taxis, and there's all this noise going on around him. And then at the moment he gets into the cab and shuts the door, the background sounds stop. Ah, yes, there we go. He's got his own little cocoon, but it's not as secure as he thinks, as indeed our lives never are.
But I love what you were saying before about the kind of grid sort of thing. It makes me think a bit like sort of Pac-Man almost, you're kind of chomping the little bits as you go along. And, what happens if you suddenly exit the maze? What happens to you after that? And that's almost where Max is. I do think the depiction of the city is a big aspect of noir. Not every noir is set in the city, but most of them are. Most of the obvious ones are, or create a contrast between the city and the wilderness, shall we say. We have the surprisingly lengthy opening section of the film where we have, again, lots of overhead shots, and it's sunshine and it's sort of, the golden light of California and what have you, which is all shot on film, shot on 35mm. And then, as it gets darker, we transition to the digital, and obviously we're going to be talking about that, but it texturally feels very different as his level of comfort increases, so the visual dynamics alter. One of the ways that I think the film certainly distinguishes itself is how it uses, in an interesting way, the depiction of the city as a place for loneliness and displacement and anxiety, and also as a place of violence. I mean, how do you think it handles that aspect of it? I do think it's impressive.
Los Angeles is is probably the most filmed city, at least in American cinema, not least because, well, there's a big film industry there, in case you hadn't heard. So there's many locations right there. Yeah, and Mann is somebody who's lived in Los Angeles most of his life and turns his camera on it in all sorts of dramatic ways. I mean, though he's only made 2 films set in LA, Heat and Collateral, less than a decade apart, and they are both, I think, central, seminal, magnificent depictions of the city, but in different ways. If Heat is very much about concrete, Collateral is about steel and glass and chrome. And it does this with, as I say, these overhead shots where the city looks like this circuit board with constant flow and delivery and reception of data. Every person seems like a byte. And Max transports, that's all he does. And then Vincent's introduction into this, he's like a worm, a computer worm, programmed, targeting, focused. But interestingly, of course, Vincent says he doesn't like LA. He doesn't like that it's so spread out and disconnected, which I think, again, is crucial, because all these various buildings we see, there's an anonymity to it. And the fact that we drive between these various different locations over the course of the film shows that, go here, go here, go here, go here. And they're not identical. So there's a distinctiveness to them, but there's also an anonymity to them. Quite often we come into an interior. We don't see people enter a building. We see them already there. So it's almost like you can flick from one spot to another. And I think the idea of it being this depersonalizing environment is emphasized throughout. And of course, an aspect of that involves the suddenness of the violence, that you can have somebody like Vincent who comes in, dispatches, bang, and then moves on somewhere else. And this again comes back to the existential side of things, there's a randomness to it. There's no good reason, no bad reason to live or die in that respect. And I think it's crucial that this is this urban environment, this 21st century urban environment. You could make Collateral today, and I don't think it would be vastly different, except the technology would be even more apparent, I think, now.
I am unsure about one aspect of all of this, and I was really wanted to get your opinion on this, because I just kept watching it, and the first time I saw it, I thought, surely this film should be set in New York. And I couldn't understand why it wasn't. Also, because it's kind of like the cabbie culture in New York is so huge compared with LA, where everybody has a car. So what do you think? It always holds me slightly back. I mean, you can't help thinking that the original draft was probably originally set in New York at one stage.
Yes, it was.
Aha!
The original script by Stuart Beattie, it was set in New York. So after Ali, Mann had started working on biopic of Howard Hughes, which then went on to be The Aviator, directed by Martin Scorsese, with Mann as producer. And Mann was looking around for a different script, and he found the script for Collateral. And at that point, it was set in New York. But Mann, even though Beattie still gets sole screenwriter credit, in interviews, Mann has said that he did sort of rework the script extensively. And part of that was transplanting it to Los Angeles. And I think that's because it was something that, for Mann, it fitted more with his sensibilities. Because if there's one... Now, okay, I visited Los Angeles, I visited New York, but obviously that was very brief. I was there as a tourist. And if there's one key difference between them, New York's a city of community, of communities. Los Angeles is a city of anonymity, of disconnection. And I think that is what makes LA a more fitting setting for Collateral. Now, I'd said if it were made today, would it be vastly different? One thing that would be different is it wouldn't be a taxi cab, it would be an Uber, which is another demonstration, I think, of the sort of anonymity and depersonalization and the further extension of neoliberal capitalism. Obviously, there are taxi cabs in Los Angeles, but I think by setting it in around taxis rather than around personal cars in a city of 10 million people where everyone's got a car, it does give it that sense of outsiderdom, of disconnection, because Vincent comes into LA and it's said that he's going to be leaving again the following morning. So I think it's all about being that outsider. And even though Max is clearly a part of the city by virtue of being in this car, but a car that is simultaneously a private space and a public space. So it's an interesting tension in that regard. It would be easy to imagine the film in New York, and I believe that when the casting was going around, some of the names suggested for the part of Max, one name was Adam Sandler, but as a joke at least, someone did suggest Robert De Niro. And I expect everyone else, Mann included, was like, really? Come on.
If he got in the taxi and it was Travis Bickle, what an interesting film would that be?
Yeah, Vincent versus Travis. There's the crossover we all need.
But enough about that. Let's go back to Michael Mann. You mentioned a few of his other films. So how do you see that sort of fitting in?
I think it fits perfectly. Collateral fits and continues Mann's explorations of existential identities within contingent contexts. Every Mann character, and it's concentrated on the protagonists, but I think it applies to everyone that we see within his films. They're attempting to make their own way within an array of conflicting expectations and requirements. And I think these arrays of expectations and requirements and the tensions that those create with the individuals are especially well presented in Collateral because it is so focused, because it takes place over a single night. On the DVD of Collateral, Mann does a commentary, and he talks about Collateral being like the third act of a traditional drama. By focusing all on this single night, it's simultaneously presenting Los Angeles as a space that is rigid and contained, but also wild and random. I also think it fits generically because, yes, Mann has clearly been influenced by what's understood as film noir, and Thief and Collateral and others can certainly be considered as neo-noir. But more broadly, of course, these are something that noir is often associated with is crime. And crime as I mentioned before, runs throughout Mann's oeuvre, from Thief to Manhunter, Miami Vice, the TV show, and then Heat, Collateral, Miami Vice, the movie, Public Enemies, Black Hat. Now, this is probably indicative of where we are with contemporary filmmaking. I don't know if we want to praise or blame people like Kevin Feige and the Russo brothers for this, but let's imagine a connected universe, the Manverse. It's actually quite easy, I think, to imagine a connected universe that includes these various films. But interestingly, they don't need overt connections because the context is enough. So you've got this criminal, not exactly empire, but syndicate in Chicago, Thief. Then it's employed Frank. And it could have also employed Neil McCauley, De Niro from Heat. There's a novel sequel to Heat, Heat 2, 1988 to 2002, which I have read, and it mentions in that McCauley is in Chicago prior to the events of Heat in Los Angeles. It's also mentioned that Vincent Hanna, Pacino in Heat, previously worked in the Chicago Police Department. So it's easy to see that kind of crossover there. I can also imagine, speaking of Vincent Hanna, Detective Fanning in Collateral, played by Mark Ruffalo, I can imagine that he would know about Vincent Hanna. Then you've also got these contraband drug networks in Collateral that could very well overlap with those in Miami Vice, and the hiring of the sort of private, the high tech or the private security forces that get hired that Vincent is part of. I can also see those being the kind of mercenaries that crop up in Black Hat. And beneath all of these is both the criminal networks and the crime movies that were established, because the criminal networks in the United States were very much established in the 1920s by Prohibition. And while the product over the decades has changed, those networks were sort of the foundation of that. And then you have the crime films, the gangster films of the 1930s, which helped to establish this genre. And one of those key figures, of course, is John Dillinger, the protagonist of Public Enemies, because Public Enemies is a crime film partially about the relationship between criminals and crime films. So Public Enemies works as kind of a founding myth, I think, a foundational myth for Mann's other work, just as his earliest set film, The Last of the Mohicans, works as a founding myth for America. So the Manverse is one that is, I think, thematically, if not narratively, connected.
Well, the Manverse idea, which is great. I mean, you said that, and of course, it made me think of David Thompson's Suspects. Have you read that?
No, I don't think so.
The entire novel is based on characters from films and drawing this idea of a grand narrative in which characters like George Bailey from It's a Wonderful Life are connected to J.J. Gittes from Chinatown and so on and so forth. And it gives it a kind of grand narrative, and it sort of pays off at the end, because you start off with one James Stewart character and you end up with another James Stewart character at the end. It doesn't all work, because a lot of it feels like you're just sort of creating backstories for the fictional characters. But, it's like Laura from Laura turns up, these sorts of things. It's really worth a read, but it's sort of, it's very much trying to do what you're discussing there, this idea of a kind of intermingling within a set fictional universe where really they can all somehow talk to each other at some level.
I guess the closest actual example of that would be the moment in Steven Soderbergh's Out of Sight, when Michael Keaton turns up playing the same character that he did in Jackie Brown. That would be the most overt example of something like that.
Man, you were going to drive me around tonight and never be the wiser, but we're into plan B. Now, we got to make the best of it. Improvise, adapt to the environment. Whatever, man, we got to roll with it.
You just met him once and you kill him like that?
But I should only kill people after I get to know them?
I'm not up for this.
What are you gonna do about it?
So, Tale of Two Vincents. Tell us about Vincent. Vincent, tell us about, does he unleash monsters from Max's id? What's Vincent? Who is Vincent?
Well, Vincent is a force bereft of conscience or consideration, and by his own words, indifferent. Contrast that with Max, who is in this rut, in this spiral, unconsciously perhaps looking for a way out. To have these two come together raises so many lovely questions, I think. So many brilliant tensions get brought out. Vincent is, as we say, we only get these snippets of him. It's worth noting, of course, that that's what we see. But I describe the film as being textured because I can get a sense that there is more that we don't see, but we can sort of feel it. And that's because what Michael Mann does is he creates these very detailed character dossiers that actors then have to engage with, like where are they, what sort of place did they grow up in, and what was their, in the case of something like Vincent, what was his military service. So for the actors and the directors, that is all there. They are informed by that. We don't know it. All we get are possibilities. So as I said before, we can sort of speculate on what Vincent may have been previously. He tells a story at one point about he never knew his mother and his father beat him up and then died of liver disease. Is that true? Yeah. Here's a fitting perhaps comparison. Is Vincent perhaps a bit like the Joker in The Dark Knight? Maybe he tells a story like that to every cabbie who drives him around, because this is his MO. There's a different version of Collateral in which Vincent is successful in his mission, which he clearly has been previously. He's been able to, he gets these cabbies, they drive him around, and at the end he kills them and uses them as his fall guy. But I think what's interesting about the clash with Max is that Max has the anonymity of driving a cab, and therefore is somebody that Vincent can use as a fall guy. And you mentioned before this sense of some molecules of humanity remaining in Vincent that create this weird bond between them. I love the point when Vincent stands up for Max when his boss is threatening him.
Still there? I'm talking to you. Back.
He's not paying you a damn thing.
Who the hell is this?
Albert Ricardo, Assistant U.S. Attorney, a passenger in this cab, and I'm reporting you to the DMV.
Well, let's not get excited.
Not get excited? How am I supposed to not get excited? Listen to you try to extort a working man. You know goddamn well your collision policy and general liability umbrella will cover the damages. Now what are you trying to pull, you sarcastic prick?
Look, I was just trying to...
Tell it to him. Don't tell him he's an asshole. Go ahead.
You're an asshole.
And there's this moment after he's done that, he gives Max this odd look, and it's almost like, I don't really know what I'm thinking here, and I don't really know why I did that. Maybe it's a frustration at Max allowing himself to be pushed around, and he doesn't like that pushing around. He wants people to stand up for themselves, to adopt the kind of force that he has, to just make things, take some control of your life. And we can go into ideas here of, toxic masculinity, of like, yes, I must take control. I mentioned the man verse. So let's not go into questions of the manosphere here, because I think Vincent is a lot more interesting than that. Max's anonymity almost works too well, because actually during that scene when Vincent helps Max out with his boss, there is a point where Vincent feeds Max some lines. Tell your boss he's an asshole and you're going to shove this cab up his ass. Max takes on aspects of Vincent's persona. So most obviously at the club El Rodeo, when Max goes in to meet with Felix, the representative of the drug cartels, played by Javier Bardem, Max has to play Vincent, as it were, says, yeah, I'm Vincent. And then he adopts some of Vincent's mannerisms. He used some of his words like, hey, Darwin, I Ching, shit happens, got to roll with it. And comes across being as vicious and dangerous as Vincent, even though he isn't. And then a moment later on, when after Max has crashed the cab, Vincent's run off, a cop comes, he's arresting Max, and then Max sort of turns the tables on the cop, and he uses the line, when did this become a negotiation? And earlier, Vincent said, when was any of this negotiable? So that's, I think, interesting as well. Max was the unexpected, was the spanner in the works for Vincent, precisely because he took on Vincent's capabilities too well. Perhaps, other cabbies that Vincent could have picked up could have picked up Vincent more accurately, would have just gone along with it, maybe because they were less, less experienced as cabbies and had more personality of their own, and therefore would be less able to take on more of Vincent's. Does Vincent bring out a certain aspect of Max? I feel it's almost like he projects a part of himself onto Max. Mann has described in his commentary that he sees a sort of odd sibling relationship between them in terms of that. So Vincent has always encouraged Max too much. And of course, we can also read it very much in racial terms because, of course, Vincent is white, Max is black. So we can read it in a variety of ways. Vincent brings something out of Max, but perhaps part of what Max has taken on is some of Vincent's coding.
So this is a kind of perverse learning opportunity for Max.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, completely. I mean, and indeed, Max acknowledges that because the point when Max rebels, he starts driving the cab really fast. Vincent gets worried. He's saying, slow the hell down. And Max says, I've got to thank you. I never looked at my life like this. We're all here in this big ass nowhere. And yeah, his rebellion, Max has this profound experience of seeing his life. He has this moment of realization of like, this is your life. This is your existence. It's to get Fight Clubby here. This is your life and it's ending 1 minute at a time. Yeah. In the end, Max takes the lessons of Vincent too well for Vincent's own good. First by crashing the cab and then by shooting Vincent and of course rushing to save Annie. And the film's arguably very generic, but also quite interesting finale.
I mean, there is a strong traditional streak in terms of narratives within Mann anyway. I tend to feel, I think quite often it's the treatment that brings out the originality. It's a very episodic film, of course. You go from, as it were, one set piece murder to another with, you could argue, the important stuff happening in the rides in between, of course, because that's where the character stuff happens. But that's not always the case anyway. But I've always found that very intriguing, and I do like that as part of his work. And I was, with the exception of, maybe The Keep, which is also probably the film of his that I'm the least familiar with. I think I've seen it once, and it was a very long time ago. I know there's a brand new all singing, all dancing Blu-ray due out in September, at least from Australia, because apparently the American one sold out before it even went on sale. So kind of, did you get one?
Not yet, but there's also a documentary on the way about the making of The Keep.
What, is it a completely separate, independent thing?
Yeah, to which I contributed.
Wow, when's that out?
Again, later this year. I don't know if my bit is included or if I'm on the cutting room floor. But yeah, it's something that's been in production for a long time, but it is finally on its way. Available in Australia, and yes, again, limited edition, so very expensive.
Right, yes. Shame that. But what are you going to do? Yes. But going back to this a minute, I wanted to ask you, this is a real spoiler thing, so apologies in advance. But we have already spoiled the entire narrative anyway, so what the hell. The Mark Ruffalo character. I think, obviously, another Marvel actor, and you can compare his performance with that of previous two other Hulks, and he's clearly the best one, I think, in my view. So I really like him. I think he's a fantastic actor. Gives a really interesting performance in this, because it has to be very quickly sketched in. So I'm sure that he had a very long character profile, courtesy of Mann. But I'm very curious about what you think about his role as the detective, as Fanning, because he's there with Peter Berg, who also terrific director in his own way. They have this it's this odd moment when you shift from this very claustrophobic, enclosed environment within the very narrow confines of what's happening within that cab, to suddenly it's okay to start cutting to a police investigation where you find out things that Max doesn't know and that maybe Vince doesn't care about, but nonetheless you create suspense for the audience, like this business about the fact that it may very well be that Vincent is this person who uses a cabbie as an ultimate fall guy, so ultimately he's going to kill Max at the end, that sort of idea. Because we only find that out because they have a conversation, the two policemen, about how they've heard about this case where, and that's it. It's all you know about it. Then you get these other scenes with other police figures. One of them was played by the great Bruce McGill. And it's interesting because I think Fanning is someone you start to care about because you see more about him than anybody else, and he's sort of figuring things out. But also he's the first one who says, no, Max isn't the killer. I wanted to ask about this because obviously it feeds into the notion you were talking about before of Max taking on that persona, because it's almost like he needs to, toughen up a bit to really survive, to really try and make something of himself, because he's been stuck in this rut, going round and round in circles, stuck inside this maze or inside this, little wheel, hamster wheel for 12 years or something, where he says he's trying to put his business plan together and get his money together, start his limo services after 12 years. It's clearly not going to happen. They're starting to zero in on this idea that the taxi is going around and is where the assassin's coming from, but that it might not be the driver. Whereas they're just going to they're going to arrest him and take him away. So I love that idea, from what you were talking about, the sense that the two characters, in some moments they merge, and in other respects, one just assumes the personality of the other, or at least particularly from Max's standpoint, for convenience, but also because it sort of says, oh, maybe there is another way to get things done. Maybe this is worthwhile, and maybe I have it within me to do that. Maybe actually I have unknown depths. The Ruffalo character is in a way, very sympathetic because he's quite a smart guy, and it's nice to have someone who's looking at it from the outside, who isn't stuck in the suspense of the moment and who isn't blocked by that problem. He's able to actually take 3 steps back and look at it a bit like it's almost like a sort of director, isn't he? Because he's looking at monitors, he's looking at shots. He says, go in, zoom in, do this, do that. I quite like that. I mean, is Ruffalo the director substitute? And what about what happens to Ruffalo? Is he there just to get killed in a surprise moment? I mean, what do we think about him?
I wouldn't say he's the director substitute precisely because he does get taken out that way. I don't think that Fanning is there purely for the shock of him being dispatched. I think he is there as another vector for the audience to follow. It's easy to imagine in one respect that the film could have actually been focused on Fanning. It could have been focused on the detective. He is something of a red herring, perhaps, for the audience and Max to pin their hopes on in that respect. So, we're thinking like, yes, he can. He's the one who's figured out the truth. He's going to help Max. Okay, yes, nope. Which means, okay, another comparison. It's not just the shock. It's the shock combined with the allegiances. I mean, the most famous example probably of having to shift our allegiances in cinema would be Psycho. I mean, we're following Marion Crane, and then a third way into the film, spoiler, there she goes. And then our allegiances perhaps shift to the character of Norman. And while obviously we are attached to Max throughout, he is, the one that we are probably rooting for. Having Fanning there gives us that as well. And perhaps because, again, Vincent is such a sort of a blank slate, there isn't a great deal to attach to in his case. Never, plus, the whole murdering thing might make people say, no, I don't like you, even though he's kind of cool. So I think that's what Fanning serves. So someone for us to root for, and therefore it gives us a sort of emotional wallop, just like it does for Max when he is killed off. And in addition, I think Fanning representing the police, the LAPD, and then, as you say, Bruce McGill crops up as an FBI agent. It's another contingency, especially since the FBI and the LAPD are working not really together. They share some information, but then the FBI is like, yeah, we're doing this, we're in charge. But Fanning's like, no, I'm doing things my way. And again, apologies, but I am pulling on Mann's commentary here, where he describes that the sequence at the club Fever is where the various different vectors converge, where Vincent and Max arrive, where Fanning arrives, where the FBI arrive, where the further hitmen from Felix, where they arrive, and it's all converging where Peter Lim, another witness, is there, Vincent's target. So that's, I think, what we do that. And notably, of course, after that, so all of those vectors converge, and afterwards we are only left with Max and Vincent. So over the course of the film, we have different figures, different characters, different narrative threads being built in, and then most of them get cut off, and we're just left with this one, which is perhaps where the film, and then fittingly, it kind of circles back to where it started.
What if it had been Hannah instead of Fanning from Heat?
Firstly, I think it would have been bigger because Hannah's more senior. However, if we want to do really wacky crossover, unfortunately, by this point, Hannah had actually become Will Dormer and had gone off to investigate something in Alaska and suffered from insomnia.
That would have been fascinating.
Yeah.
The film seems to follow quite naturally in the wake of a number of existential thrillers that often deal with hitmen as an obvious figure that seems to be contradictory and ambivalent in terms of how you access that as a viewer. Because on the one hand, they're often cool, exciting, they're very self-possessed, they're usually played by remarkably charismatic, good-looking actors, and yet they go around killing people. And as you say, they probably are a bit sociopathic in some respects. So how do we think this film falls within that existential side of it? Is it just well, I mean, we've touched on the existential malaise idea, but is it almost like a middle-aged killer movie? I mean, one of the oddities for me, and I want to get into it just a little bit later, but Vincent is always in grey and he's presented that way. So that suggests both something halfway between black and white, but also a certain level of age. I mean, is that, how do you think he fits in with that?
I do see the film as an existential thriller. I think it's using the genre framework to explore these issues of identity, anonymity, race, gender, post-industrial life. And I think that the visual presentation of the environment, as well as the figures within it. In terms of Vincent's greyness, I think the look is fine. I think it works. It might be a somewhat ham-fisted, on-the-nose attempt to express his lack of a soul. It's all been leached out of him, or he never had one, and that's being expressed visually. So we can read it in that way. I don't think it's entirely necessary because the suit would have been enough without the hair, the grey hair and the stubble. But what I think is more interesting is how this works as part of the overall visual palette. Because what we find here, and this ties into the aspects of the digitization that we'll talk about in more detail in a bit, everything kind of fits into the background. No one is in anything particularly outstanding. We see other characters, they tend to be, Annie is in kind of a dark black or navy suit. Felix is in a kind of sort of a beige sort of outfit as well. Fanning and Max, they're dressed more casually, but again, nothing that really stands out. And I think the grey, it does and it doesn't stand out, if that makes sense, because everyone is kind of easily can be blurred into the background. They can be decompiled, if you like. There's a form of erasure going on here. And I think that we can think of Vincent as the extreme version of this. He is the one closest to being erased because we know the least about him. His greyness indicates, I think, his anonymity and, in a sense, almost his ease of being erased, deleted, if you will. And the fact that he is indifferent is a further expression of that. So I think it depends how you read it. It might come across as being a bit too obvious, like, oh, come on, yeah, we get it. He's in grey, he looks all grey. He's the grey man, which and I believe is another movie featuring a hitman.
By the Russo brothers.
Yeah, there we go. But at the same time, I think it is also part of the overall digital, visual and thematic aesthetic in the film. So I think that's how it works.
How do you think Tom Cruise works within that? Because obviously he's been cast completely against type, and it's one of those films where he's being, I mean, it's almost like they're giving him the suit from Rain Man, you know, but they've made it shinier and it's Zegna instead of Armani or something. Then they give him this wig. Now, I'm going to come back to the wigs because I got a thing about wigs, but I don't think it's terribly convincing. The hair always bothers me because I know it's not Tom Cruise's hair. So I just keep thinking maybe it's a disguise. But I don't think that's what you're supposed to think. How crucial is it to have Tom Cruise instead of Adam Sandler or what have you playing this role? What do you think he brings to it?
Well, Adam Sandler was considered for the role of Max.
Sorry.
Not Vincent. Cruise does really well. I think in two respects. Firstly, I think he does a great performance. But secondly, I think it's really useful that he's been cast against type. Now, Cruise has built a career, a very successful career. 40 years at the top of the Hollywood tree is nothing to be dismissed. And he's built that career on being charming and engaging. And he does that so well, most consistently, of course, in Mission Impossible, but more widely as well. But here, what we have is a presentation of somebody who is empty. This is as I said to say, it's kind of a blank slate. And when he does the grin, it feels performative. It's like, I'm joking because I can. Why not? And I think there's the best expression of this is the point when he confronts two thieves in the alley after he's killed his second target and Max has just been robbed. He doesn't display any fear or anger, just this complete locked-in professionalism. There's this moment, it's a long shot, so we can see him. It's not a close-up, but nonetheless, I feel in the moment we see this complete blankness in his eyes. And he uses terms like, yo, homie, just because it fits the context. Now, in some respects, it's very interesting if we read it from a sort of star studies perspective, because Tom Cruise is, I think, a construct. Whoever Thomas Mapother IV really is, we don't know that as audiences. All we see is the film star construct of Tom Cruise, arguably the last remaining film star. If you like, Vincent is a demonstration of taking on this other persona and being able to flip what he does in a different direction. So I think it's great, and it's one of Cruise's best performances. I wish he played more villains like he did in this, and not necessarily a villain, but certainly a despicable character in Magnolia, and of course Interview with the Vampire, and also the nasty piece of work he plays in as a senator in Lions for Lambs. Now that Cruise is perhaps finished with the action side of things, if the final reckoning was the final Mission Impossible, and he might realize, dude, you are in your mid-60s. Please stop trying to kill yourself with these stunts. Instead, I would like to see him move into a later stage of his career and play different sorts of characters and play more villains. He could easily play somebody like the character of Felix in Collateral, some drug, some gang boss who treats life in a very offhand manner. And it's also worth noting, is it a disguise? I mean, Vincent may well not be his real name, but also it's worth noting in terms of the prep for the film, what Cruise actually did is he did attempt anonymity. He played the role of a FedEx delivery man, and he was able to deliver something without being recognized.
Well, because he was wearing the wig and what have you?
No, he was wearing a baseball cap.
And that's all it took. That's got to be humbling.
Possibly sunglasses.
I was going to say, it's humbling, isn't it? You put a hat and glasses on and nobody knows who you are.
Yeah, especially when you are one of the most famous people in the world.
Yeah, okay.
So I think it works on multiple levels.
So let's go digital, Vincent. Let's talk about the rise of digital.
0011001100110001.
And in particular, in the movies. So I guess I became aware of it in a number of different ways. But one thing that I remember noticing was on big network television shows like ER. At a certain point, they started using digital for shots at night and often for anything that involved water stunts. And it always bothered me because I could always tell. At that point, you could tell the switch from 35mm to digital. And then obviously it became a big thing, I feel, because of George Lucas and the Star Wars prequels. I think that's probably it. And certainly there was a feeling that by the time he did Attack of the Clones, which is the second of the prequels, and which is very much a film noir inspired science fiction story. He's got a private eye, he goes to a diner, the lighting is all through sort of slatted lights and so on and so forth. It very much channeling that approach. I don't know, it totally works. You need to rewatch it. And I don't say that lightly. I like Revenge of the Sith a lot, but otherwise I tend to keep my counsel about those films. But this was shot after those films had been made. How do you position it in terms of the rise of digital in Hollywood? Because it's still early days. There's no getting away from it.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It was nowadays digital film is the norm, but yes, you're right. It was the early 2000s when it started coming in. Mann was an early adopter of digital. There are a few scenes in Ali that are shot digitally. I think what Mann is doing with digital is a very clear aesthetic choice. Okay, from a practical perspective, digital does make filming easier. As we know, since the 1980s, films have been edited digitally. So the fact that you don't have to convert to different formats helps. Digital cameras, smaller, lighter, and they have greater storage capacity. Therefore, it's cheaper. So in the 2000s, we can see digital becoming this distinctive aesthetic. And Mann was the significant player in this. First with Collateral, then Miami Vice and Public Enemies. And interestingly, Black Hat was his first film actually shot entirely on digital. What I think digital does is it creates an aesthetic that is perhaps a further step removed. If we think about concepts of film realism is, from a photochemical perspective, it's taking this impression. It takes what was there and creates a facsimile of what was actually there. It's something real, if you like. It's literally making the impression of light upon the photosensitive material. What digital does is a step removed from that, because digital is, by its very nature, a disassembly. It disassembles what is before it and into zeros and ones, which is then reassembled. So whenever we look at something digital, we are looking at something that is not necessarily real. And I think a lot of Mann's work can be described in terms of the hyper-real, especially when we're dealing with high definition. The colors can be brighter, the outlines can be crisper. I think it's interesting in the case of Collateral, that's often not the case. It's not that it's necessarily soft focus, but there is this, as I've said before, this interesting kind of blurring of the different colors together. I remember a review in Total Film magazine described this LA as a bruise, as in all the different shades of color that are at work there. And simultaneously, you can see them, but there is this, I think, significant, not even a blur, but the transition from one shade to another. And this comes across in Vincent's outfit as well as the others. It gives an indication of how easily people can fade into the background. And it goes back to this idea of the anonymity. I think there are crisper images in Miami Vice and Public Enemies and Black Hat. In Collateral, it comes back to the noir aspect. It's the shadow. So, and what digital film allows one to do is shoot in low light levels to a far greater extent than you can with film. And the digital very much takes us into this dark heart, the dark city of Los Angeles. So I think one of the best moments is during the climax when Matt and Annie is moving through the darkened offices. And we have this shot of LA outside the window. And then Vincent's head kind of rises into it. And his head is this clear shadow, this blank space on the screen. But what's in the background, we can still see it. But there is this sense of, it's almost like the darkness is spreading across. The reason this is a digital noir is that it is blurring and compiling, deleting, fragmenting people into their environment. That's what the digital's doing.
Aesthetically, it's very interesting to look at what's happening at that point in the development of digital, because I think you can definitely tell the difference between the sequences shot on 35mm, which are the three extended interiors, the jazz club, the dance club, and then I think the sequence with Javier Bardem. They're all shot in 35mm because they're in controlled inside environments, and there's kind of no big advantage for shooting on digital. And certainly the sequence in the jazz club, which is absolutely one of my favorite moments in the film. I think partly just because you've got Barry Shabaka Henley in it, and he's really good. And there's that whole funny thing about Miles Davis, but it's also the kind of the shifting and the tone within the sequence is quite subtle, and it's nicely handled as you realize he's not just there because he's a fan. You kind of wrong foot the audience and the character at the same time. And I think it's, up until now, it seemed fairly linear. And now you have what William Goldman would refer to as a reversal. So you have something unexpected happening. So it's a nice little twist, but in a horrible way.
That was Miles, man. That's the way he was when he was in his musical headspace. Fierce.
But did you get to talk to him?
I'm better than that.
No.
I played for about 20 minutes.
Unbelievable.
How'd you do?
What to do? Well, you really ain't shit when you're playing next to Miles Davis. But he carried my ass.
What do you say?
Said one word.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. It meant good, but not ready. It meant look me up when you are.
But also it has a very different feel in terms of saturation and detail and shading. It looks different. It at the time, if you read that American Cinematographer article, they talk about how, it was so important that we managed to make them both look the same. Well, they don't look the same, not even remotely, because one of the things about digital at the time, and this is just to do with the sensors and what have you, it does flatten the images compared with 35mm. You don't get the shading. You don't get the roundness. You get all these other things. It's at that point, it's a trade-off, because therefore the external nighttime space has this incredible look to it, but at the same time you lose certain things. Like you say, it actually you get a certain level of softness, which I think is just inevitable, because you're realistically trying to give the impression of only shooting with available light, which is quite extraordinary and gives you a very different feel. So I think it works very well, but it is different. To me, it sticks out, not in a horrible way. It just means that certain things happen and look a certain way, and certain other things happen and they look a different sort of way.
Yeah.
I think that's fine, because they serve a different purpose. Obviously, digital's evolved, but the calculation is that 80% of it is digital and 20% of it is 35mm. And until Black Hat, he was still mixing and matching?
Yeah.
Sort of film and digital, is that right?
That's right.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, how successful do you think that is within the confines of what was available in terms of technology in 2003, 2004? How big an impact do you think that had at the time when you first saw it?
This is the tricky thing, because of course at the time I saw it, it would have still been projected on film. So in that respect,
well, yeah, we should have. Sorry, I should have specified that, because of course it's the exhibition side of it that changes everything.
Yeah.
Because you're still not projecting digitally, and that's what makes all the difference today, doesn't it? Because you harvest it digitally and project it that way. That's very different experience from, no, you've got to take the digital, turn it into something that can work on 35mm and project it on 35mm. So of course the native 35mm stuff looks different from the stuff that's been converted.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes very obvious. Yeah.
It does unsettle. Even if it's a kind of thing that often so much of film works on a kind of subconscious subliminal level. So you're not necessarily aware of what's happening, but you feel something is different. And I think it does have that effect of saying the digital, for lack of a better word, looks odd. And I think largely because we're accustomed to seeing that more sort of rounded, more depth in faces. And yeah, especially thinking about the sequence with Javier Bardem. It's always worth noting Javier Bardem has a very prominent nose, and that nose in that sequence, it does, I'm not saying it sticks out, but the way it's lit is, it seems quite prominent. Whereas in the later sequence, in other sequences, when it's at night, when we're in the cab, there's softer edges. But I do think it's worth noting that looking at Mann's work as it's progressed with digital, he's developed very much this kind of fragmentary approach. So we've got these early scenes in Collateral, such as the taxi depot garage when we're introduced to Max, and it's an aesthetic he would use a lot, becomes a lot more apparent later on, especially in Public Enemies and Black Hat. It's not exactly discontinuous editing, but it is, if you like, what David Bordwell described as intensified continuity, as things keep getting that little bit faster. And there's also weird jump cuts. There's a point after Vincent knocks Max down on a bridge. We've got a close-up of their two faces, Vincent at the top and Max at the bottom of the frame. Vincent says, let's see what else you can do. And then there's a jump cut before he moves. And initially his face, the kind of nose to nose. And then there's a cut so he is slightly higher in the frame. So I think it's part of this fragmentation, which goes back to the idea, of course, that is what digital does. It disassembles.
How big an impact do you think this has had on Mann going forwards then? I mean, it seems to me that he certainly never looked back.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he adopted this early on. He was doing digital before it was necessary, and he's made it his aesthetic. You have other filmmakers like Christopher Nolan, Steven Spielberg, Paul Thomas Anderson, who very much want to use film, and good for them. That's fine. Mann is somebody who uses the digital. I can understand it being very freeing, especially if you're working in this genre. If you're working in crime films, and if you're working in urban environments, if you look at Miami Vice, if you look at Public Enemies, you look at Black Hat, they predominantly take place in these urban environments, and they often have scenes at night. And if you're able to use available light, I can understand the practical benefits. You don't need quite so many lighting rigs, and it allows you to create a sense of ripped from the news site, because I think it's also reflective of wider cultural context and forms of expression. Because, of course, nowadays we're all carrying a digital camera around on our phones, and the amount of footage that gets, sometimes it's news footage that is shot with these small handheld cameras, or it might be like police body cams, or spreading across social media. I think Mann was kind of ahead of the curve here. He was identifying that the snatched, the brief, the fragmented digital image was going to become one that we were familiar with, and he's using that as an effective storytelling device. If he wasn't making feature films, maybe he'd be a TikToker.
There's a thought. He's not a director who I think of having a signature style when you think of, say, someone like De Palma, for instance. But he does have signature shots and a signature approach. But the signature shot that always sticks out to me is that intensely close shot behind the ear, usually the right ear, but sometimes the left ear, so that you can see, and again, obviously digital cameras make this so much easier, of course, is that you get right almost inside somebody's head, and preferably if they're wearing glasses, it means you can see through the lens as well, or the distortion of the lens. What do you think about that?
This sort of signature shot and other aspects of Mann's style, it's kind of like his approach to genre. Use established, recognized techniques, but in your own way. So typically, if we're sharing the perspective of a character, the camera's over the shoulder. Mann brings us closer, does it his way by placing us behind the ear. I always think of a key scene in The Insider when Russell Crowe's Jeffrey Wigand is being threatened by his former employers, and we are looking through his glasses when this is happening. And there's also some tiny lipstick, as they were called, cameras were used in Ali that were attached to the actors' heads during the boxing sequences. Now, what this does, obviously, is it brings us closer to the character. You want to feel what it's like for this person? Great, here you go. If you want to be more up close and personal, we probably have to put the camera behind their eye. Give it time. But what it also does, I think, is it provides further perspectives on the world of the film, partly through depth of field. So you can have focus pulls within that behind the ear shot. The ear could be in focus, the glasses might be in focus. What the character is seeing might be a bit more blurred, and then you can pull the focus so that it is more in focus what's far away from them, as perhaps it expresses shift in concentration. What it also does is it provides, word I've used before, texture. The texture that if something is shot from behind the ear, we can feel the texture of the world. Sometimes in terms of if we can see like the hairs on their ear or the fabric of their clothes. So there's that sense of literal texture, but also I think the wider environment, feeling the texture of this by bringing us so close. So it's bringing us close to the characters they're in, and also more intimately into the world of the film by feeling its texture.
I was curious to talk to you about what I've referred to as the circular end, which is going back to this aesthetic idea that you mentioned, this visual pattern going round in circles to a certain extent. So we get to the end and we end up on a train, and we have this whole scenario where Annie, who we saw right at the beginning of the film and was the kind of the customer in the taxi who he had this interesting moment with, this interesting conversation where he actually gave her this postcard of the island that is this kind of image that he has in his head, which of course
is being Max.
Max is so sorry. Yes. So Max is the image for him is this idea of almost a rather solitary idea, of course, as this island surrounded by sea, as opposed to being in the middle of a city. And she's actually vaguely taken by that. So she's actually gives him a professional card. And it turns out that she is the final victim on Vincent's list, which is, I like to think it is fair to call it horribly contrived. I mean, I wish that, I don't know, maybe if Vincent had done it on purpose, if he'd seen her getting out of the cab and he sort of said, oh, okay, I'll pick that cab because I know I've got to get back to her. So that would have made it almost acceptable. And there must have been a conversation about that because it's so easy to do. Instead, they time it so that she leaves the cab and goes into the building and Vincent doesn't see her. The logic being probably that he would have turned around and gone round and he would have killed her first.
I wouldn't agree with that because the point is she's going in when there are still plenty of other people there.
It wouldn't work. Exactly. Yeah, that's the. But at the same time, they've deliberately designed it so that he doesn't know that there's a connection between those two people. And you could easily, by literally just having him come out of those front doors 20 seconds earlier. So I always find it strange that they do that, partly, obviously, because it serves a different purpose. It's about the connectedness of things, having tried to argue the opposite within the film. The idea that, Vincent says, I hate this city because nobody knows anybody and everybody has their own lives and then nothing overlaps. And we're proving the opposite, presumably, yeah. Or that the long finger of fate has its own peculiar sense of humour. What do you think about that?
I largely agree with you. I do think that the finale of Annie, played by Jada Pinkett Smith, being Vincent's last victim, it is contrived. It's absurd. And it kind of robs the film of a sense of being realistic. Now, narratively, it can be explained. Annie got out at her office. Vincent was casing the joint, as they say. And then he does, as you say, catch Max's cab. I do like this idea of the finger, or indeed the dance of fate element, though, because it's notable that Vincent goes to Max's cab, then he moves on, and then Max calls him back. And later on, of course, Vincent talks about he and Max having fates intertwined, cosmic coincidence, all that crap. And to which Max says, "You're full of shit." But I think, and so we can just dismiss it like that. But I think it is part of the film's philosophical investigation. Mann's films are always about this struggle between self-determination and contingency. And in the case of Collateral, that contingency can actually be considered, well, is there actually fate at work here? Is this a coincidence or is it destiny? The film doesn't answer that. And we could say, oh, well, come on, that's the logic that only exists for screenwriters. It's there partly to provide the emotional connection that Max and Annie established earlier, and then comes back to it. But then it also serves to say, well, perhaps these three figures were always destined to come together. And maybe it's interesting that, going back to what we were saying about Fanning, because we have Annie right at the beginning, and then the tertiary character for the middle is Fanning. So we've got Max, Annie, there goes Annie, here comes Vincent. Oh, here's Fanning, there goes Fanning. Oh, it's just Max, Vincent. Oh, and here's Annie's back again. In that respect, I think it comes back to, I guess, our allegiances. It's part of the manipulation of the audience. And as I always say, if you don't like being manipulated, don't watch films, because that's what they do. But I think it is also part of, the philosophical speculation that the film is doing. How much is choice and how much is determined?
I mean, definitely in Mann, the free will versus determinism debate is there in most of his work, after all. I mean, I always think The Insider is a particularly interesting sort of exploration of that. The idea of the, Lowell Bergman getting Jeffrey Wigand to do what he wants to do. So he sort of enables him to do it. So the argument is, you made me do this. No, I didn't make you do this, but I greased the wheels. I help you make the decision that you kind of wanted to make. And, one of the most interesting scenes in that film is when he's just walking up and down with the sea behind him, trying to decide whether he's going to go and give a deposition, which could get him into massive legal problems. and he's got to decide whether he's going to do it. And in the end, he sort of says, well, has anything ever changed? He says, no, hell, I'll go do it. And it's kind of a great moment. I mean, I do really like that film.
Absolutely. I actually think The Insider is Mann's most impressive film. Heat is my favourite, but The Insider I find even more impressive.
I would absolutely agree with you there. Yeah. In fact, I know I rewatched it yesterday. I wanted to get slightly in the zone, and I couldn't find my copy of Heat. Otherwise, I would have been watching Heat.
And now that we've been face to face, if I'm there and I gotta put you away, I won't like it. But I'll tell you, if it's between you and some poor bastard whose wife you're gonna turn into a widow, brother, you are going down.
Mann makes films about masculinity. I think he's interested in lots of other things as well, and we do see those. This reminds me, many years ago, I showed my girlfriend at the time Heat, because saying, oh, we should watch my favourite film. Okay. And at the end, she commented that it was very chauvinistic. Now, I bristled at this, and we had a very long and detailed debate about that. And funny enough, the debate actually lasted longer than the relationship. Not the reason we broke up. We're still friends now. It's all good.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And I will say, I do think she had a point. It is chauvinistic to focus on a particular gender. But I think what Mann's films do as a whole is they explore masculinity, and more often from a critical than valorizing perspective.
Yeah.
And in the case of Collateral, we've got these two men who are very different. One of them is all about the drive, about doing what he is set out to do, and the other is maybe doing driving, but that driving is kind of aimless. One could do the similar story about two women, or about a man and a woman. That could be fine. What I think is interesting about the man is very much, a recognized trope within his work. As you say, it's usually two or three, sometimes just one man, as in Thief or Manhunter, Black Hat, Ali. Those have single male protagonists. Although the women are very much on the side, they are, not the focus. I do think that, again, there's the texture that Mann creates of his cinematic worlds. I always get the sense that the women in his films do have lives. They're not what the film is about. I certainly find that the case with Heat and The Insider. And I think that in Public Enemies and Black Hat, there's a bit more balance with female characters there. And The Last of the Mohicans as well. In all of those, you do have, I think, there are significant female characters, and they do play more of a role in the drama. Now, in the case of Collateral, structurally, Annie is the damsel in distress. We can get Todorovian on the archetypes that work here. Vincent is the monster, Max is the prince, Annie is the princess who does have to be rescued from a tower. Let's not forget.
I've never thought of it that way. Oh yeah, that's even better.
Neither had I. It just came to me. Yeah, she's in a tower and he has to rescue her. However, I think I still think her character has enough detail to indicate there is more to her. She is not simply there to be the victim, to be the romantic interest for Max, because of the way she's introduced. The sequence between Max and Annie in his cab, we learn about her as Max does, because we are in his, I think more often than not, I'd have to check this, I think we spend more time in the front seat of that cab than the back, because we are sharing Max's perspective. She talks about her work process, being prosecutor, and she doesn't throw up before a big case. She cries. So I get the sense that if you wanted to, and Mann does this because he's got obviously a background working in television. And in television, you've got to space out your characters. You've got to give them a lot more detail. You can do that. Perhaps any Mann film could actually be remade as a TV show, and you would have the time to see the characters in more depth, in more detail. So those dossiers that Mann compiles, they work in terms of giving us as the viewer more understanding of that. And for a comparison, if we were to say with a more high-profile director, Christopher Nolan, some of his films are quite similar. I mean, The Dark Knight is very much, kind of heat with capes. But Nolan sidelines female characters to probably not deliberately, purely a matter of his focus on male characters, but they become female characters are often to the point of irrelevancy or plot device. I mean, how many Nolan films have used the dead wife device? Most of them.
Yep. There's a lot of fridging. Yes.
Oh yeah. Man doesn't do that. He doesn't make films about women, but his worlds have women in them that I think are interesting in their own right.
Now, I particularly like Diane Venora in The Insider, and there, of course, he was hamstrung, by the fact that he had to fictionalize that person because she wouldn't sign a waiver. Basically, they couldn't film her, so they have to change her name. And so you assume that everything you see about her is the exact opposite of reality, because that was the greatest distance they could make from being intrusive when she didn't want to be depicted on film. Which is a shame, given that that's a film where they worked so hard to give it that sense of reality. Talking about reality and things not appearing entirely real, and this is a completely personal obsession, and some of those friends of ours that we have in common will laugh when they hear this, but I am not even remotely convinced by Vince's hair in the film. I feel like the wig looks like a wig, but I tend to think that about Michael Mann films anyway. I think he needs to get people to do his hair more cleverly, because Val Kilmer has got terrible wig in Heat, and this is a guy with tons of hair, so I haven't understood why he has to have this totally unconvincing haircut, but for whatever reason it doesn't look real to me at all. And I feel exactly the same way about Russell Crowe as Jeffrey Wigand in The Insider. It's just really odd. They just all completely unconvincing and always throw me off. I get totally obsessed with, why are you wearing a wig? Why aren't you looking like you normally do? Why didn't they just grey your hair or whatever? I don't think this is something that bothers you at all.
You're absolutely right. And I didn't notice it. I only knew that Crowe wore a wig for The Insider because I'd read about the film's production. This is the first I've heard about Kilmer wearing a wig in Heat, and Cruise in Collateral. I thought that was a dye job. The only time I have been aware of wigs in film was purely because I was set up for it. I remember when Mark Kermode reviewed The Big Short, he described it as being a bit wiggy. And I did notice in that Steve Carell's hair, it's like, oh, that probably is a wig. But otherwise, I clearly have very poor wigdar. And yours is very well developed.
Mine is very finely attuned. I have very serious conversations with people about toupeology. But obviously it's more fun when it's, somebody who wears one in real life as opposed to when it's for a role. And, I think it's because in this film, I think it's to make Tom Cruise look a little bit older, because he's about 40 here, I guess, 41, yes, I suppose, when they shot it.
Yeah, he would have been about 40.
Yeah,
point, yes.
And you could argue just a little bit too young for it in the sense. So, I mean, I don't know, but you sort of think, what if it had been, Gene Hackman or something, somebody who's much more experienced, can have a winning outside demeanor, and yet that they have this steel core on the inside. Or Clint Eastwood, even better, of course. He would never have done it, but and would have been, even at that point, would have been in his mid 70s by that point. I mean, the guy's having the most amazing career ever. But
yeah, it's weird you saying that. I mean, it would have been a very different film, I think. But just because of what you were saying, I can imagine Denzel Washington would have been. Yeah, he probably would have been in it around 50, early 50s at that point, if not a little older. But the point is, Washington's continued to do quite actiony roles into his 60s, as of course has Tom Cruise. So yeah, that would have worked as well.
Well, they're both actors who look younger than they really are. I mean, that's the thing, is that apart from anything else, Cruise looks younger than his actual years. So he could easily pass for 34, 35 without the wig. That was why I assumed they did it and gave him the stubble and the grey stubble again, but beyond the whole colour coding, which we've dispensed with. But no.
Russell Crowe was 35 when he played Jeffrey Wigand, who was meant to be like 55.
No, that's the thing. It's to age him. It's to do the opposite.
Significant.
It's the same thing in both films. It's just to make these kind of hunky superstar actors, make them look sort of older and middle-aged and a bit more plausible. Obviously, in the case of Wigand, no, that's his actual age. He would have been, at the time the film took place, Wigand would have been about 53, I think. Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that. Whereas, of course, Pacino, of course, is eternal. You know, I mean, I'm sure they spent a lot of time on his hair, making him look fantastic. But, you know, it's just part of the persona. He has great hair. So what are you going to do? One can only be envious.
Get your hands in the air! That's funny, coming from you.
So what do you think have been Mann's great influences on his filmmaking?
Well, as mentioned earlier, crime films, gangster films, urban type films, these go back really to the 1930s. I mean, earlier, but I think we can establish the genre we can identify the genre as being established in the 30s with offerings like The Public Enemy, Scarface, and Manhattan Melodrama, which appears in Public Enemies. Mann's obsession with the urban environment, I think, is very much influenced by these. I obviously feel the single most influential film on Mann is probably The Asphalt Jungle, arguably the text for heist films. Also classic noir such as Out of the Past, and a Japanese film called Pale Flower about a gangster negotiating changes once he's released from prison. Sounds familiar. In interviews and so on, Mann has spoken highly of films like Last Year at Marienbad, Dr. Strangelove, Raging Bull, Sweet Smell of Success, L'Atlante, and Apocalypse Now. He has an anecdote about when he first decided he was going to be a filmmaker. It was shortly after watching a Murnau film. So perhaps the film influences upon him have been more stylistic, about, you know, playing with, experimenting with a cinematic form. Perhaps his background, his origins growing up in a rough part of Chicago gave him the awareness of particular social milieu he wanted to investigate and dramatize. He is actually on Letterboxd, where he lists some key films for him. I know, yeah, you can follow him. I certainly do.
I think I have to. Right.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'll post a link on the site.
Yeah, and according to his Letterboxd account, his favorite film is The Battleship Potemkin. Which is how fitting that we are recording this in 2025 and that film is 100 years old.
Awesome.
But I think that makes sense because The Battleship Potemkin is, of course, very much about, among other things, architecture. And we can see the architecture reflected in the concrete canyons of heat, the corporate enclosures of The Insider, and the steel and glass of Collateral. And of course, also the Battleship Potemkin is most famous for is its use of montage. And while Mann mostly uses continuity editing, as I've mentioned, he sometimes breaks the flow with jump cuts in Collateral and Heat, and this fragmentary style that he's very much leaned into over the last couple of decades. It's evident in Ali, and it becomes prominent in Collateral, and it's even more prominent in Public Enemies and Black Hat. So I think those are what has influenced Mann. In terms of whom he has influenced, you mentioned earlier Peter Berg, who is, I think, something of a protege of Mann's, because Berg, he appears in Collateral and he directed The Kingdom and Hancock, which Mann produced. Mann actually has a cameo in Hancock, which when I saw Hancock, I was like, that's Michael Mann. What's he doing in front of the camera? And I think that Berg's style in those films especially has this sort of unsteady, fragmentary approach. Having said that, I think Berg is less successful at delivering that than Mann is. I mentioned Christopher Nolan before, and I think that could be that Mann might be an influence there. Obviously, in the case of Heat's influence on The Dark Knight. However, I think it's interesting to note that Nolan's use of editing goes in a different direction. Mann is interested in the mood of a place, but Nolan's obsession quite clearly is time. So I think there's an influence there. And then there are some others, such as I think The Town by Ben Affleck it's like Boston Heat, I think. And you know what is the best Mann film that Mann did not direct? Is another one in Los Angeles, largely about going for a drive, Nicholas Winding Refn's Drive. But I do feel that just as Mann's influences are stylistic, I feel that his influence is more upon those who are utilizing aspects of the style, but not imitating, kind of making it themselves. I think that, the digital aesthetic of Collateral, maybe it's an influence on something like Denis Villeneuve's Sicario or Catherine Bigelow's Zero Dark 30. Having said that, I think that's more of a general development within filmmaking practice, and Mann was an early adopter of. So perhaps other filmmakers saw, wow, look at what Mann's doing. I wonder what I could do with that. So I don't think he has many imitators, but I think his influence may be quite diffuse and far-reaching.
He is supposed to be working on a film version of the Heat sequel. Is that right?
The sequel to Heat, yes. I'm not holding my breath.
Well, what is it? He's 82.
Yeah, he'll be 82 now. Yes, yeah, he was born in 40. He was born in 43. So yes, so 82 now.
Okay, I mean, but if anyone can do it, I guess. But on the other hand, it takes him a long time to get things going. I suppose he's so detail orientated. Yeah,
absolutely.
I made a joking reference to you before about Italian stuff, and I deliberately didn't go see Ferrari because I am sick to the bat teeth of these films set in Italy about Italians, like House of Gucci, where everybody speaks like this for the entire fucking film. It's very, very annoying. We don't talk like that to each other in Italy, funnily enough. And I just cannot believe that somebody as stylistically sophisticated and like Michael Mann, who, apart from the fact that Tarantino even made fun of it in Inglourious Bastards and the whole language thing, but that, I mean, I don't know, I was there in 1990 when in Hunt for Red October, Sean Connery stopped speaking Russian halfway through and all of a sudden said, okay, we're not going to speak English now because we're all speaking amongst each other. Because I could not watch an entire film where they all talk like that, and also where you have Penelope Cruz playing an Italian, where she's speaking the whole thing with a Spanish accent, which is just too irritating for words. Also, why does Adam Driver keep being cast in these films? You know, he's extremely not Italian. So I'm personally offended.
Fair play.
Not seriously. I'm annoyed, but, you know.
I mean, when I heard that Ferrari was going to be done with actors speaking English but with Italian accents, I did somewhat roll my eyes. I was like, oh, come on. Either have them speak in their own accents, which Mann did in The Keep. All the characters in that are German, pretty much, or Romanian, but they speak English. That's fine. And there's some sound English, some sound American. Ian McKellen is doing a weird Chicago accent for whatever reason.
Leaving aside very personal, silly things. Thank you so much for discussing Collateral. It's been such a pleasure. It's an interesting film, and now I feel like I understand it even more and certainly want to go see it again. So that's brilliant. So where can listeners catch up with what you're up to these days?
Well, if folks want to find me, you can do so on a train circling LA. But it might be easier. You can find me at Dr. Gaine. That's DrGaine on Instagram, Letterboxd, Blue Sky, and Threads. Please check out my podcast, Invasion of the Poddy People, which can be found on the Not Just for Kids movie club feed. And that's where myself and my co-hosts, James and Russell, talk movie news, reviews, deep dives, as well as recommendations, rubbish, and swaps. You can visit The Geek Show and the Critical Movie Critics websites for my reviews, and please visit my blog, Vincent's Views, where I post links to my various publications, reviews, and podcast appearances.
And we'll have all the links on the webpage as well for this podcast. But in the meantime, are there other noir-related things that you would like to suggest that we, as listeners, could go and explore?
Absolutely. I mean, I've spoken a few times about Christopher Nolan. His early work is very noir influenced, especially following Memento and Insomnia, although you could call that a film blanc. But I'm going to give a particular shout out to a film I rewatched recently that is arguably the final classic film noir, and that is Touch of Evil from 1958.
Great film.
Directed by Orson Welles, who also stars alongside Charlton Heston and Janet Leigh. Speaking of people not playing their own nationality, Charlton Heston in Mexican-esque makeup, whatever that means. But aside from that, I think Touch of Evil is really powerful stuff. It is fetid, it is sweaty, it is oppressive, it's about corruption, it's got about borders, it has these looming figures, especially Wells himself, and menacing spaces. It's also worth noting that it's part crime noir film, and it's also part Western. And I think it uses these genre tropes fantastically. And it has one of the greatest opening shots in cinema history. So if you've not seen Touch of Evil, listeners, check out the opening on YouTube. And that should give you an indication of whether you want to watch the whole thing. Now, I watched this film years ago as part of that module as an undergrad I mentioned on film noir, and then I revisited it recently for another podcast, and this gives me a chance to give a shout out to that podcast, Facts on Film, a podcast that talks about fat representation in film and wider media. Now, this is hosted by the amazing Hannah Ogilvie-Young, and it's a podcast that has really opened my eyes to being more aware of fat representation and the constant oppression that larger bodies experience. Just do a quick, going back to Collateral, it's notable that the character of Vincent in that is clearly a bit of a fat phobe, because he several times slags off his first victim, just described him as fat guy. Oh, this fat guy, El Gordo. So another thing to say, yeah, he's a nasty piece of work. But anyway, Touch of Evil, check it out, and podcast Facts on Film, check that out. And thank you so much, Sergio, for inviting me on. It's been great to talk about. I've been enjoying your podcast, Tipping My Fedora, for quite some time, and it's been really great to have a chat with you about Collateral and wider things. And we've talked about a lot today. But yeah, it's been great talking about noir and so on with you.
Now, this is brilliant. It's been a great tale of two Vincents. Thanks very much. Okay, and let's do this again really soon. You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix, and it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.